Today, the Foreign Affairs Committee is taking evidence as part of our inquiry into the UK-EU reset, rebuilding a strategic partnership in uncertain times. We have three great witnesses in front of us today. I wonder if you could introduce yourselves. Perhaps we start with you, Professor.
So my name's David Paton. I'm Professor of Industrial Economics at Nottingham University Business School. I'm also editor of the International Journal of the Economics of Business.
Hello, I'm Naomi Smith. I'm Chief Executive of Best for Britain. We produce a lot of policy recommendations related to trade and a lot of polling about public opinion on the relationship with Europe.
I'm Anand Menon. I'm an academic at King's College and Director of UK in a Changing Europe, which is a think tank devoted to UK-EU relations.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. I think I'm going to start just by asking a few general questions, and then there'll be some specifics from members after that, if that's all right. So I suppose it's really a question for all of you, which is, how would you describe the geopolitical importance of a UK-EU reset, and what is at stake? Do you want to start, Professor?
Certainly, yes. Yeah. The concern in government from an economic point of view is the trade progress with the European Union. To some extent, when Brexit happened, there was real worries that was going to be a big hit to trade and hence GDP. The latest trade figures, I think, are somewhat reassuring in that UK overall exports, for example, have increased in real terms since 2019. There has been a shift from goods to services. In the EU, there's been a little reduction in exports, although it's hard to figure out because the figures are very hard to interpret because of the way goods are categorised. So some goods that were categorised as exports are no longer included. You've had some big structural changes to the UK in terms of our manufacturing output, but overall, to date, trade seems to have held up pretty well. There are concerns on particular sectors. So, for example, the government's concerned about travelling artists and musicians, about particularly small exporters who may have been hit by the sort of checks in the agricultural sector. So there's certainly certain sector areas where they want to really work on. The big picture, of course, is at the same time, in terms of our UK-EU relationship, is our relationship with other strategic partners, the US, CTPP, the Cross-Pacific Trade Partnership, Commonwealth, and so on. So I think there's an important balancing act in terms of, where we can, improving our EU relationship, but also not risking other relationships, but also other potential relationships in some of the faster-growing parts of the world, where there may be quite a lot of potential for future growth and economic benefit.
Right. Naomi Smith.
Well, you asked us to describe the geopolitical environment, and I think the tectonic plates shift underneath our feet on what feels like an almost daily basis. But it's very clear that what's emerging are three large blocks. We have North America, we have Europe, and we have China. And we all know that trade declines with distance. So geographically, we are in the UK closest to the largest single market in the EU. It is our most important trading partner, and the growth on offer for the UK, and let's not forget that the government's stated number one ambition is to get growth and to have sustained growth and fast growth within the G7, and the trade improvements that could be negotiated during any kind of review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, according to Best for Britain's work published, undertaken by Frontier Economics but published by us, showed that there is up to 2.2% GDP growth available if there is deep alignment on goods and services with the EU. I'm sure we'll talk about the detail of whether or not that is possible. But the other point I would like to make on the geopolitical situation isn't simply about growth and what is on offer and the geography of proximity, and the importance of that to trade, but reliability. And while my fellow panellists is correct to say that we should be open to doing trade deals with other blocs and countries around the world, as of course we have been over the last few years, we must remember that the reliability of the trade deal that we've got with the EU is far more reliable than those that could be negotiated, particularly with the current administration in the USA, which is changing its trading strategy on seemingly a weekly, if not more frequent basis. So I think that members should be mindful of that, mindful of the proximity, the growth on offer, and the reliability of a closer trading relationship with our reliable partners in Europe.
Ed, you had a question.
I just wanted to quickly, sorry, Ms. Smith, trade declines with distance is certainly something I have repeated. Can we actually evidence that?
Yes, and I'm very happy to share with the committee afterwards many pieces of work that have been done on that, not just by Better Britain, but others. It happens the world over. And in the climate that we're in at the moment, which is in an era of democratic backsliding and deglobalization, we are seeing more concentrations of trade within regional blocs than we have done previously. This is for a number of reasons. There is, of course, unrest the world over. We're not just seeing issues that you will be extremely familiar with as a committee in terms of conflict in the Middle East, but we've seen global supply chains being disrupted because of conflicts all over the world and from natural disaster as well. And so for all of those reasons as well, reliability of trading proximity is something that offers us more security than doing even more trade further away, and that's before we think about the climate impact of bringing lamb from New Zealand versus North Wales. Comment you. Professor Menon.
I'm not sure how much is left to be said, to be honest. I mean,
can I ask you about SMEs? Because there was a comment made about small and medium enterprises and how, it was... And I just wondered, when we were talking about trade holding up, can we really say that when it comes to small and medium enterprises? I
think we can say it isn't holding up when it comes to SMEs. I mean, the LSE did some work 2 or 3 years ago which showed that whatever the aggregate figures show, the number of discrete trading relationships that exist between us and the European Union has fallen quite significantly. And the evidence suggests that that fall is made up of smaller businesses that don't have compliance departments, don't have big legal departments, so can't cope with the paperwork that is now being imposed on them. It's just too complicated. So I think SMEs have been far more badly hit than larger companies. And of course, one of the consequences of that is you don't hear about it as much.
Yes. And when we talk about barriers to trade, we think of tariffs, but the barrier for trade for small businesses is the red tape.
Yeah, I mean, the barrier for trade for all businesses, red tape. I mean, even if you go back to those much maligned Treasury forecasts that came out whenever they did 2017, they were absolutely clear that tariffs make up a small proportion of the frictions, and it's the red tape and it's being outside the single market that's the majority of the cost.
Right. Sorry. Do you want to
say something on geopolitics? I mean, very quickly, I mean, what I would say is there's obviously an intimate link between geopolitics and the reset.
Yes.
It's obviously, and probably quite sensibly, the government's ambition to try and minimise that at the moment by trying to remain on good terms with both the United States and with Europe. I mean, we're in a particularly exposed situation as the UK because one is our closest security relationship, the other is our closest economic relationship. And whether or not that is a strategy that pays off, only time will tell. But of course, one of the interesting things is European states are all reacting differently. The language of Friedrich Merz about Europe needing to be independent, or the long-held position of the French about an autonomous Europe, is very much at odds with what our Prime Minister is saying at the moment. But I think we'll have to wait and see what the American administration does to see whether this strategy pays off.
Yeah. I wondered, Naomi Smith, does the government have an overall strategic vision for this reset? And we've heard a little bit of a suggestion of some of the things the government might be interested in, but I mean, what do you think of their shopping list, and could it be longer and could it be more ambitious?
It certainly could be more ambitious, and I think it should be if they're concerned about what the public is looking for. So at Better Britain, we did a poll with YouGov of 5,000 voters very recently, and trade is voters' top priority at the upcoming EU-UK summit, above defence and tackling migration. The public is looking for progress on trade. You asked, do I know what the government's strategic vision is? We know what their red lines are. We know that is a firmly held view, and that they believe that the mandate that they were given at the 2024 general election was based on those red lines. And so at Best for Britain, the work that we've done in terms of producing policy recommendations through the UK Trade and Business Commission that we run, is within those red lines, and there is a huge amount that can be done. And the growth figures I talked about earlier, up to 1.5% GDP growth if there is deep goods alignment with the EU, and up to 2.2% GDP growth if there is deep goods and services alignment. The detail of how you do that deep alignment is within the government's stated red lines. Now, the problem with not having been very explicit about what their strategic vision is, and I understand that they don't want to give a running commentary on live negotiations, is that it leaves the rest of us to speculate as to what their vision might be. We've heard that obviously defence and security is a very, very high priority, and I think everybody is now expecting an announcement on that following the 19th of May summit, but that they've also had ambitions around a deal on agri-food sector and touring artists, which was mentioned previously. But our work with Frontier Economics, the independent econometric analysis that we had done earlier this year, showed that an agri-food deal will deliver 0% GDP growth. So while it will, of course, ease difficulties for some in the agri-food sector, it doesn't in aggregate help the UK economy, and indeed the agri-food sector itself gets the biggest boost when you do deep alignment on all goods because of the interconnectedness of supply chains across the country.
So in order to get was it
1.5 if you do deep goods alignment, 2.2 up to, and I should caveat, we asked Frontier to give us conservative estimates, so we see these as a floor, not a ceiling, and that is without Trump tariffs, but with tariffs, those numbers come down to about 1.5% for goods and services alignment, and about 1% on deep goods alignment.
So goods alignment means what? It means... Go on.
Excellent question. So we talked about Brexit red tape, and in particular the impact of that on small and medium-sized enterprises, and the most important way to align on goods will be through the mutual recognition of conformity assessment. So at the moment,
That's extraordinary.
It is.
For those of us who are getting lost, and I imagine for some people on the listening who might also
I will try to make it just so when we talk about the thousands of times all of the new Brexit red tape can go around the world from the UK traders that are desperately filling out double the amount of paperwork, it is exactly that. So if you want to produce a product that is qualified to be sold into the single market, it has to be produced to those standards, and it has to be certified as such with a CE marking. In the UK, we now have the UKCA marking. So what this has effectively done is it's either had a depressing effect on trade, and exporters have decided to no longer sell into the single market because the margin is not there once you add on the extra cost and time of duplicating that conformity assessment, or they are spending the money and the time to do both in order to still sell in both jurisdictions. So mutual recognition of conformity assessment sounds very dull, actually extremely important. With the UK Trade and Business Commission, we've taken evidence from thousands of SMEs across the country, every corner of the UK, every sector of the economy, and without question the thing that comes up from all of them is we need to get rid of that red tape, and it's not good enough to just have the deal on agri-food. We need it for all goods if we're to remove those trade barriers at the border.
Just help me with this. So things used to, and I'm sure we all remember seeing things with CE on,
correct,
and now British goods have a CA. Yep. In practice, so I can see that in practice it means that you then have to fill in a whole lot of forms and say that your goods conform with CE, and they don't automatically. But what's the real difference? What benefit have we had from a CA instead of a CE? What differences are there now in our goods?
Well, that's an excellent question, which gets us into the opposite of alignment, which is what business is calling for to have in terms of the relationship with the EU, and on to divergence. So when we left the EU, we had the retained EU Law Bill Act that ported over existing EU law onto the statute book that we wanted to bring over. But of course, since then, the EU has continued to upgrade and change its animal welfare standards, its product safety standards, children's toy compliance, and we've not kept pace with that. So unless we either totally align and keep pace with that, or you have one or two things. You either have passive divergence. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. Titanium dioxide sounds absolutely delicious, I'm sure. That is now a banned ingredient in the EU. It is not banned here in the UK for consumption. When do you eat it? Well, it's often found on things like icing, birthday cakes, that kind of product. And so now if you've got a product containing titanium dioxide, you can no longer sell that into the single market. So what you're getting to, Emily, is the point about that passive divergence or active divergence, and we've chosen to go a very different path to Europe. So things like AI and tech seems to be a direction where we're having more active divergence. And the reality is that the benefit in terms of the product is either that we've chosen to follow a different standard, or we do want to keep pace with the standard, so we're having to do dual regulatory regime compliance checking, and that is adding onto the cost for the business and then inevitably being passed on in inflationary means to the consumers.
I'm going to come to Phil in a second, but can I just ask one more question and then I will shut up? But so you've talked about the deep alignment of goods and explained to me anyway, so that I now understand what it is you're talking about. When you were doing the polling, what did the public think about this?
The public are very, very supportive. We poll it at a constituency level as well as a national level, and it's very clear that across the country the public is prepared to make trade-offs for a deeper trading relationship with the EU. They are very, very keen to get that growth that they know is on offer. They've seen it for themselves that they are not better off, that there is a premium to what they're paying as a consequence not only of global factors, but they're seeing the separate impact of the inflationary aspects of being outside the single market. So they want that alignment, definitely. It's the most popular option when given to people in every constituency in the country. So voters get it and want it, and I think the risk is that they are further ahead of their own ambition for the reset than perhaps we've heard from the government today.
What does popular look like? Are we talking 42%?
That's an excellent question. I will share all of our polling with the committee in writing afterwards. But 53% think the EU closer trade tie would have a positive economic benefit. 54% are happy to follow some EU rules to achieve this. 66% want a 2-year youth visa scheme, reciprocal. So there's plenty of detail, and I'll share that with the committee afterwards.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to go to Professor Menon and then Professor Paton, and then I'm going to go to Phil.
I just want to make a couple of points. Firstly, alignment is different to access. So alignment makes sense because it means that if we have the same rules as the EU, it means businesses don't have to conform to 2 sets of rules. It doesn't mean that you're free of the checks getting into the single market.
Right.
That requires something completely different called dynamic alignment. And dynamic alignment is an inherently one-sided process whereby we decide that we will automatically track developments in EU regulation and that their court will have oversight over whether we're doing it right or not. And it might involve us paying as well. So we can align, but it doesn't mean we're getting into the market. And the second thing is, I think in this country we sometimes forget the fact that the EU has a vote as well when it comes to the reset. And at the moment, they're a little bit lukewarm on mutual recognition of conformity assessment, not least because the fact that they don't do mutual recognition has meant that it's been good business for their conformity assessors. That's to say they've nicked a lot of that business that we would otherwise have had if they'd recognised us. And so there's a slightly mercantilist rationale behind this as much as anything else.
Okay, yes, Professor Paton.
Yeah, just to go back to the polling, I think it's a little bit more nuanced. So the poll Naomi was talking about found 41% of people wanted closer ties with the EU, but also 41% of people wanted either weaker ties or the same ties. So it was fairly evenly split on that. But I think we do need to be a little bit realistic about the opportunities for growth from the reset, which isn't to mean there aren't good things we can do. But given that trade overall has not been significantly affected, partly because services are so important for the UK, we also need to take account of the fact that the EU is not growing very fast relative to other parts of the world. So we have a very good trading agreement with the EU in that it's tariff-free and quota-free. category. So relative to our trading agreements with other parts of the world, it's really, really strong. So if you take a step back and look globally, you look where the gaps are, we've got this very strong relationship with the EU, we've got the growing Canadian and Pacific Agreement, which covers a lot of countries and is potentially quite powerful. Where we have a gap is in two places, India and America. And America is our biggest single trading partner and actually the fastest growing trading partner. Distance, of course, is important, but it's only one factor, particularly when you come to services. So in terms of looking at the scope for future opportunities, it's really important to think about the benefits of alignment, and particularly if we go down the route of dynamic alignment where you lose political control but also economic control over standards, and the risks that might face to, for example, deals with the US, not just alleviating the high tariffs, where we've got a particular vulnerability on aluminium and cars with the 25% tariffs, but looking for the opportunities for further developing services, relationships, mutual recognition there, mutual standards on food. So the US document on trade barriers was really exercised with the SPS, the agri-food standards in the EU and their general approach to them. So there are benefits, but also risks in terms of how we tackle the reset, and we need to sort of be quite clear-headed about what those benefits and costs are.
I've got to get to Phil.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come back to the comments you made, Naomi Smith, about how regulatory divergence is impacting on the UK. And I wonder, Professor Paton, whether you have conducted any research which looks at what impact that has on how competitive British exporters are in the European market compared to our European competitors, and what impact that's having.
Yeah, there's very little research looking directly at the competitiveness of UK exporters. I think it's fair to say that there is a difference between the larger exporters who have the sort of compliance and are large enough to cover the sort of fixed costs, and the smaller exporters. It's worth making the point, of course, that trade wasn't necessarily free when we were in the single market. It was costed differently. So the UK government paid the costs of trade through the sending tariffs and VAT contributions to the EU. Those costs have now been moved to companies, and the smaller companies have been further hit, but they're faced with similar costs to exporting to different to other countries. Of course, it's worth saying with alignment that in terms of access to the market, companies that choose to export can choose to opt to agree with EU standards, and they have to do that if they want to export. The issue with the single market is that all companies, whether or not you're exporting, have to comply with particular standards. And so in terms of domestic production, there may be issues there and costs. So that's where I think you need to think, okay, so there's potentially some benefits from alignment, and certainly in terms of mutual recognition is probably less risky than going down the line of dynamic alignment. And I think that's probably something important for you as a committee to grill ministers when they come back with their deal. But also the costs that might imply for the UK-based production who aren't exporting to the EU. But also, of course, as I said, the implications for how that might impact on other deals. So we need to remember we are a very big and important market for the EU, and it's right that we look at what the EU want out of it. They do have a vote, they also have incentives. So it's in their interest to sort of have standards where we're aligned that may make it a bit more difficult for other exporters to export goods to the UK, because, of course, that's less competition for their markets, and particularly in the area of agriculture, that's a very important issue for them.
Good.
Can I just particularly pick up on that point about the balance between the benefits of alignment versus being able to regulate independently? And obviously not being part of the EU has meant, for example, in the UK that we've been able to become world leaders in gene editing of fruit and vegetables. And I just wanted to get perhaps your opinion, Professor Paton, on the implication of things like that where we've been able to see benefits, what the implication might be if the reset kind of risks mirroring those agricultural rules on the...
So I think there's two areas where there's risks. One is the risks to growth, so they're clearly potentially very important areas in terms of innovation in food, but AI in particular. So the EU has perhaps got a reputation for being experts in regulation, but hasn't been the best in sort of facilitating startups and growth and innovation. And there can be a trade-off between innovation and regulation. Regulation's important, but there is a trade-off there, and probably the EU perhaps hasn't got the balance right when you look at the sort of the growth figures compared to the States and the Far East. So there's lots of potential there. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning, although I'm an economist, but also it's a political costs in terms of political autonomy. So we've talked about animal standards. So one of the things the UK have done is banned live exports of animals for slaughter. They've tightened up shark fin regulations. There's other animal welfare things which wouldn't have been possible in the single market. Obviously a very important, a significant part of the government's manifesto coming in. So we need to be aware of the trade-offs that if we do go down the route of dynamic alignment of the political restrictions that can then impose in terms of loss of autonomy. The other thing to add into it, of course, is there's been reference to whether we do have an SPS agreement or some sort of dynamic alignment. Will the EU expect a contribution? We don't know. We haven't had a white paper from the government in terms of what their lines are, but that's obviously an important issue in terms of direct potential financial costs. And if we come on to defence, that's a particular issue there.
Can I just say there's also a geopolitical element to that. Clearly, in the case of agriculture, if we sign an agricultural deal with the EU, we can't do one with the United States. So there's that direct trade-off. But also, I think, in areas like AI or financial services, if we decide to diverge from the European Union, we could benefit from that because, God knows, we could regulate better than the EU does in those sectors. The difficulty is, in the new security environment, both AI and capital markets are going to be crucial to European rearmament efforts. And one risk is that if we decide to go our own way or look like we're going to move closer to the United States, we might then find ourselves having greater problems accessing those European funds and European initiatives on rearmament. So the geopolitical situation complicates things, I think, quite fundamentally.
We're going to get to Dan and then we're going to get to Sir John.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just put on the record I'm also a government trade envoy as well as membership of this committee. Professor Paton, I wonder, from what you've said so far, obviously there is a lot of resource that it takes from government to go into this reset and to seek to create closer alignment. Are you saying you'd like to see government resource put elsewhere? I mean, what else could be done to improve the trading relationships between SMEs, say, and the EU?
Is there more that can be done to help SMEs? Yes, in terms of looking at mutual recognition and easing up some of the paperwork that needs to be done. So I don't quite agree that it's sort of, even with agriculture, it's one or the other, that we have some sort of agricultural deal with the EU means we can't have one with the US. Depends on the type of deal we have. So some sort of understanding about, so for example, the New Zealand vet deal that we have with the EU is very much based on sort of recognition. Now, the EU may not be willing to go down that route, but in terms of what the government should be seeking, that seems quite a good model that doesn't put at risk potential relationships with the US. Now, the US are very exercised about SPS and food rules. I think the political situation is, the UK isn't going to relax its or change its rules to suit the US. So if there's a deal, the US will need to comply with UK standards. And I think probably, that's a possibility, depending on what's involved there. The difficulty is if there's open-ended agreement to align dynamically with the EU issues. And I think that's where the US would have a very significant problem. So in terms of government resources, as I said before, the big scope for growth and development is in the faster growing markets around the world. That is the US, well, we'll see what tariffs have, that they've reduced their growth estimates, but the IMF is still saying the US will grow faster than the EU or the UK, but certainly in the Far East, so developing the Canadian-Pacific trade relationship, looking at India. That's traditionally been a very hard country to come to a trade agreement with. But, if you believe, you'll know better than me, but if you believe what we hear, we're perhaps not too far from being able to get something there. Strategically really important route to go down. So I don't think it is either or, but I think we just need to recognise the resources we're putting in terms of the growth agenda. Although there's certainly things we can do in resetting with the EU, that's not what's really going to drive growth in the UK economy. So
it's worth saying, though, isn't it, that when you talked about the New Zealand veterinary agreement, that's precisely where geography comes in, is that the European Union is willing to have quite a permissive regime with New Zealand, because not many cows wander over the border between New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and they will not give a deal to a country that is next door, sharing a land border with them, simply because of that factor of geography. So, geography matters in terms of the calculations as to what the EU is willing to offer different partners as well.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that under Boris Johnson's government, their own assessment of the value of a US free trade agreement was 0.16% GDP growth for the UK. Just comparing that to the figures I mentioned earlier about not dynamic alignment, but beneficial alignment with the EU for the UK on goods and services of 2.2.
I think Sir John's got more questions on the US.
I've got questions on several things. Can I start by asking, I think particularly Naomi Smith, but others too, your suggestion that there are great benefits to be had from particularly dynamic and deep alignment, to what extent is that different from the government's red line, which is rejoining the single market?
So we at Best Written call it beneficial alignment, so aligning when it is beneficial to do so. And one of the policy recommendations of the UK Trade and Business Commission was also to set up a new UK-EU Cooperation Council that could oversee alignment and divergence where it needed to happen or was in the interests of either side for that to happen. And I think that remains a good idea. And it doesn't involve freedom of movement. So it's not a return to that. That would come with single market access. So it's very much about removing as many of the trading barriers and that friction at the border that the SMEs particularly are struggling with. But, large companies are as well. They might have the balance sheet strength to absorb that shock, but it is eroding margins and having an impact on forward pricing for consumers. So beneficial alignment is about removing as many of those trade barriers as possible, but without being a member of the single market.
I mean, that sounds remarkably like what Michel Barnier used to call cherry picking. To what extent is actually that going to be available to us, where the Europeans will agree to allow us the alignment which helps us, but not accepting anything else?
Right, we are, and I think as Anand mentioned as well, we are one of two negotiating partners, and there will be give and take on both sides. And we were very pleased to see about a fortnight ago that a group of businesses and trade bodies on both sides, both the EU and the UK side, signed a letter in support of mutual recognition of conformity assessments. So this isn't a demand solely coming from UK SMEs. There is also a strong strength of opinion in favour of them within the EU as well.
But I think that is the fundamental difference between limited alignment and the single market, is both of those things are achievable from the European Union. There is no evidence that the EU would even offer us dynamic alignment on anything beyond agriculture. And it's worth saying again that this is dressed up by the European Union as principle. I mean, having an SPS agreement is cherry picking. Okay, it is preferential access to a part of the single market. So they can do it if they want to. The problem is, at the moment at least, they don't seem to want to do it in any other areas apart from agriculture. So the choice therefore becomes binary. You can do agriculture and nothing else, or you can rejoin the single market with all that includes. But and it might be a negotiating tactic that they're willing to sort of row back on. But at the moment, there's no middle ground available.
So your view is that the burdens which small businesses more generally face cannot be removed without a commitment from the UK to rejoin the single market?
I think if you want to reduce all the burdens, you join a customs union and the single market. Yeah, if you want to get rid of all the paperwork, all the checks, all the sort of inefficiencies that have come in.
Politics is always about the art of the possible, though, and we know that the EU is a rules-based organisation. They tell us that very regularly, but then they do more bespoke-looking deals than simply single market after full EU membership, as they have, of course, done with the FTA that we have called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Brexit deal we have at the moment. Anand rightly points out, the risk aversion to doing deals with countries closer than further away, but it is worth pointing out that they have included mutual recognition of conformity assessments in a pretty recent trade deal they signed with Canada. Now, we are not as close; we are much closer to them with Canada than Canada is, and of course we share a land border. But I think if there is ambition on both sides, every possibility that something more bespoke could could be achieved, and the public do want this government to be as ambitious as possible going into that reset.
Just on that, I think it is right that the EU has the ability to do that, and they face competing pressures from some of their big. We've seen that with Germany when their car trade has been at risk, from the individual countries. But from the UK point of view, I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to be clear about what is in our interests and benefits, and talking about bespoke deals, looking at the CTP model for alignment, where you do indeed look at your partner's regulations, and you look not to diverge where it's possible, but you retain complete autonomy over what the laws are. I think it's possible for us to do that as a government, and with a sort of strong hand, if you like, in that from a big picture, of course, it would be nice to improve some of these bureaucratic burdens, but that's not crucial. We are trading well. We've got a very good trading agreement with the EU. That's the big picture. It's whether we can do better at the margin, but the big picture, we have a very tariff-free, quota-free, and trade has held up reasonably well, subject to the caveat, it's so hard to interpret trade figures, but there's no evidence of any big drop-off.
Mind if I just abuse my position? There's a piece of evidence that we've had from University College London about medicine shortages and shortages of medical equipment, and that's we were talking about. We have so far been talking about us exporting to Europe, but there's also been. Could you explain? I believe that there has been difficulties with getting medicines and medical equipment over from Europe as well. It kind of cuts both ways, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't know the details of the medicine issues, but absolutely, in some sense, imports are just as important as exports. People worry about exports in terms of growth, but we import goods because they're useful to us, and we want to get them at a good price, and they're things that we perhaps don't produce in the UK, or we haven't got a comparative advantage at producing. So, I think the import process is very relevant, and I don't think the medicines thing has been highlighted by the government as an area they're looking to really work on. But that is an issue perhaps in terms of agriculture. So we've not applied the checks on agri-food coming in that the EU have going there. They keep getting delayed, and that's partly some people think that's affected the EU's willingness to agree sort of mutual recognition because they're not currently subject to the checks. We don't necessarily want to have the checks if we trust the EU standards. We can sort of unilaterally recognise, if you like, and there's some arguments for doing that and delaying our checks further. But it depends if you want to take the Trump view that sort of barriers to trade can be used as a negotiating tool, so that there is that scope is there.
On medical devices, it's worth saying that you can slice and dice mutual recognition of conformity assessment, so you can do it for particular sectors. Products, yeah. And the medical sphere is one where I think there is a real mutual. No one has an interest in either side being short of medical equipment or drugs. So it's one area, I think, where you could possibly come to an agreement to speed things up and thereby address this question of shortages. But just very quickly on the last point made, going back to your question about sort of the relative competitiveness of UK and EU industries, you've just got to bear in mind that the playing field is absolutely not level, because UK exporters face the full gamut of checks when they export to the European Union. European Union firms who export to us don't. So they have a massive advantage in terms of trade because we haven't put those checks in place as yet.
Although since foot and mouth, isn't it now?
Yeah, but that's a short-term measure for that specific crisis. It's not part of the implementation of the border operating model.
Can I go back to the dual objective of the government, which you've touched on to some extent already, but the government is keen to remove barriers and make it easier for business to trade with Europe, but at the same time wants to achieve Donald Trump's beautiful trade agreement, which is on offer to the UK. To what extent are those compatible as two objectives?
Trade is about trade-offs, and when we hear about anything the US has ever said, now, previously, under previous administrations there and here, it is very clear that they do want to be able to sell their agricultural products into the UK, and we often hear about chlorinated chicken and hormone beef as the two that are most often cited, and that is that trade-off. I think if we sort of talk about sovereignty and trading sovereignty for growth. In the other direction, you're trading the deal with the US in order to accept the products that very, very few consumers in the UK would find palatable and want, and certainly our farmers who have already been facing the impact of the New Zealand and Australia trade deals, which have negatively impacted them, and I'm sure you will have heard evidence from them yourselves. We certainly have through the UK Trade and Business Commission that would make them even less competitive. And then that's before you talk about the impact on consumers. Those cheaper, lower quality products flooding our supermarkets would then, of course, be more likely to be consumed by people on lower incomes than those of us sat in this room who would probably still opt for the organic, homegrown produce.
Just on the agriculture, I think we need to bear in mind that the UK is not self-sufficient in agriculture. We rely on huge amounts, for example, of beef imports and lamb imports, a lot of it being seasonal. Now, at the moment, we have completely free imports from the from the EU, in particular from Ireland. So as a general strategic goal to try and diversify our food access to other parts of the world is a positive goal. So, for example, we've diversified our access to sugar. A lot of sugar now comes from Brazil, whereas it used to come from France. Now, that's a good strategic objective to have. It can also help in terms of relationships with developing countries. Now, secondary is the issue of particular countries and food standards. And I think, as we said before, the UK isn't going to change its food standards in terms of US access. I think that does still leave scope for work in the US. And the big thing to focus on for the UK, the US are interested in agriculture and other things, but for us, the real sector that's important is services. That's where we've seen the biggest growth, both to the EU and to the US. It's an area where overall, and distance is still important, but overall distance is probably less important than for the transport of goods. And in terms of, thinking about mutual recognition of in the professions, legal services and so on with the US, also the cross-Pacific partnership, that's where there's some real potential for benefits. So I think, having the ambition, who knows what will happen with the US, but I think there is scope to come up with some sort of a deal. I think the relationships become more important because of the tariffs. So we know with tariffs, our aluminium sector and car sector is particularly vulnerable. So in terms of that trade-off, pre-tariffs, I think there was still perhaps more important in terms of deepening our relationship with the US. Post-tariffs, that becomes even more relatively important, which isn't to say we can't do things better with the EU, but relatively our focus needs to be on the US and other parts of the world.
I suppose, can I just come in on that? I mean, the danger for us is that a deal on tariffs is tied to a deal on food standards.
Exactly.
And I mean, when it comes to agriculture, it is the one area where there is a clear and unavoidable trade-off, which is if the Americans say you have to lift the regulations that restrict the access of our goods to your market, that is incompatible with what we need to do to sign an SPS deal with the EU. It's the only area, I think, at the moment where there's a direct trade-off. But there are indirect trade-offs lurking. I mean, as I said before, if we decide to regulate more like the Americans do in areas like AI, what we don't know is whether our European partners will turn around and say, well, whose side are you on here? I mean, it depends to what extent sort of transatlantic tensions intensify.
Yeah, I would just like to bring us back to my opening statement about 3 blocks and which one do we choose to align to, because I think the real risk for the UK is bobbing around mid-Atlantic tethered to precisely no one while they're doing bilateral agreements or tariff wars with one another. And where does that leave us? And Professor Paton touched on it as well. I think you said who knows what America will do and where it will end up on all of this, and that's exactly also my opening point: reliability. And I just think in terms of where we need to focus energy in our government at the moment, it needs to be where we can get a deal that is relied upon rather than with a regime at the moment that, tariffs 1 minute, 90-day freeze the next. We don't know come Christmas what will have tariffs, what won't, which products they will apply to, how much those tariffs will be. And so I do think the strategic imperative for our government is to prioritise. It's not about choice, it's not about choosing between, but prioritising the EU, because as Anand points out, we'll either risk not getting anything with the US because they're concerned about the SPS stuff we're doing with Europe. Europe may not give us the SPS stuff because they're worried about what an AI deal or a gene editing divergence might mean in terms of our relationship with the US, and that is the real risk. No growth whatsoever because we are stuck with the status quo. And I know you've mentioned that the TCA is a very good deal. The SMEs I speak to and the large organisations I speak to, the fishermen, the farmers, none of them would describe the current deal with the EU as a good one.
But equally, I mean, you quote the assessment of potential benefit to GDP of a UK-US trade deal as being relatively small in comparison, but that doesn't take into account of tariffs. So if, for instance, an alignment between the UK and the EU led to the UK facing the same level of tariffs as the EU faces from an American administration, that is going to change the cost-benefit analysis quite a lot.
I would imagine not hugely. Anand and Professor Paton would know better than I would on the detail of that, but given that we don't really trade many goods with the US and tariffs only affect goods, getting rid of tariffs doesn't automatically mean that you see a surge in the services, which is where our trade with the US is.
As Professor Paton indicated, we are at the moment potentially facing the same level of tariffs on things like cars and steel. If we manage to achieve a deal which meant that we were able to reduce those tariffs in comparison to the EU, that would be of considerable benefit.
Yes, I mean, it clearly would. Steel, that's less so because it depends on the category of steel you're exporting, but particularly in aluminium, aircraft wings and so on, cars, the luxury car market, that's clearly where things are very important. But I mean, it's worth just going back to the deal. We have a deal with the EU. So in terms of the strategic importance, we have this deal which is much stronger than our trading deal with most other countries around the world. So this is where, I keep going back to it, but it's not that we can't do things better, and there are particular sectors who have faced costs. But in terms of the big picture of the real prospects of that being growth, there isn't a lot more we can do that will really drive growth with a sort of relatively slow-growing market that is the EU. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing something, it's just in the big picture, that's not our strategically most important area.
Can I just take up something on the US, and then I'm going to go to Ed, but we talked about alignment in relation to the UK and the EU. When there's been negotiations, and there have been ongoing negotiations with the US for some time about trying to get a deal with the US, has there ever been any suggestion from the US side that they would change their rules? And I'm talking about let's not talk about tariffs for a bit. Let's talk about the non-tariff barriers for trade. Has there ever been a suggestion from the Americans on any scheme that they would change their rules and regulations in order to line up with ours? Isn't it the other way around, that they always kind of go, you want to trade with us, then take our standards?
Always. It's always like that. I mean, on the one hand, that just underlines the difficulty of doing deals in services, because it means you've got to change your rules at the behest of someone else or accept their rules. So it's very, very sensitive. I mean, the second is, there's continental-sized economies don't make concessions to individual countries. And that's as true when it comes to us talking to the European Union as it is when we're talking to the United States. There's a massive asymmetry in terms of just economic heft.
It wouldn't be a question, though, of the US changing their rules or regulations, just like it shouldn't be for us. It's a question of whether they're willing to export subject to our rules and allow us to export subject to their rules. That's the basis of a trade deal, as opposed to the single market, where you agree to have exactly the same standards. A good trade deal like we have with the EU is based more on that, what you're willing to export, will you accept our standards when you export, and of course you have to, and the other way around. So of course there may be an element of give and take in terms of recognising different standards in terms of checks, but ultimately in a trade deal does not have to have any give and take on the regulations themselves. You can say, well, you can trade free of tariffs and we'll try and reduce checks as long as you meet our standards, and we can do this. We can do the same.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested, Professor Paton, Paton, sorry, in returning to Ms. Smith's point about the reliability of partners, because obviously President Trump in his first term ripped up NAFTA, created a whole new trade agreement, US, Mexico, Canada agreement, and then in his second term has effectively ripped that up with the introduction of tariffs. So when we talk about the sort of reliability of a partner, how do you see the outlook for any agreement signed with the EU versus any agreement signed with the US, and how concrete should we take it to be?
I think that's a political calculation, and it depends on the sort of nature of the agreement. So I think our trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, we would hope to be stable. It will be up to renegotiation in a couple of years. Whether the EU has always been a reliable partner, I think, is also open to question. So there's, for example, in the reset, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but there's been talk of, well, we'll come to an agreement as long as you pay in to the EU funds, or you won't have access to EU spending on defence unless there's a contribution or you come to a formal security pact. So I think there's concerns on both sides. Clearly, the US, it's hard to interpret exactly what the outcomes are. I think my interpretation is that President Trump genuinely thinks the idea of tariffs at a base level can be important for his revenue, and he's been very consistent on that over the years. But there is also quite a willingness in the US and a recognition that they also need to use that as a negotiating weapon to arrive at trade deals, and that's going to be very important for the US. You look at the impact on the markets and so on. So I think there is some sort of economic necessity, if you like, that there's scope there for the US, as long as we don't put ourselves in a position where a deal is impossible.
I just slightly take issue. I mean, if you're saying which is the most stable and predictable regime, the EU or the current US one, it's the EU. I mean, the EU's got the opposite problem, which it struggles to change. I mean, the EU is very, very predictable, slow-moving and bureaucratic, whereas President Trump is mercurial. It's also worth adding that there's an element of this in our relationship with the EU, is that you'll hear from some capitals in the EU, we're not going to go too far in this reset, because what if you have an election and a fundamentally Eurosceptic government comes in and unpicks it all? I mean, in a sense, we're not going to commit ourselves to too much until there's a degree of predictability about the medium-term political future of the UK, is something that people are talking about on the continent.
Alex.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question on transparency. You mentioned some of the things that the UK is looking to get out of in the reset, SPS, touring artists, a security arrangement, but it's not always clear exactly what we're hoping to achieve, and certainly that's the case when we speak to European partners. They're very interested in what actually the UK wants to get out of this. So my question is how useful is this ambiguity in our negotiating position as we go through the reset? Should we be being more specific in our asks, or is what we're doing the right sort of approach? Maybe Professor Paton.
Sure. I mean, again, it's a political judgment here, and that there can be benefits from keeping your cards close to your chest. I think the danger is you look at what happened, for example, with the Theresa May agreement, which was announced without much scrutiny, and it was announced to big fanfare and pretty quickly fell apart, because when it came to scrutiny, the obvious flaws in it happened. So I think there's a danger of that happening. If the government come back and say, yep, this is the agreement, sort of take it or leave it, the political scrutiny then starts, and there may be sort of political noise, but there may also be genuine issues that come up that perhaps haven't been thought of by negotiators, unintended consequences, particular trade groups. So that process of scrutiny, I think, probably outweighs the need for sort of secrecy. So my view would be having something like a white paper where you set out very clearly what you want to get out of the negotiations, what your sort of red lines are, where you think there's scope for. Because of course you've got to remember lots of these things are in terms of mutual benefit for the UK and the EU. So it's thinking about setting those out, letting those be scrutinised, letting people like this committee really work on flaws in that white paper. I worry that something will come back and there won't have been sufficient scrutiny.
It's been briefed that the government's trade strategy will be published next week, I think, so we may have more detail then. And I think if we think back to when the Boris Johnson government was negotiating the current TCA, it was sort of very clouded in mystery. And the UK sort of hadn't done any of its own free trade negotiations for the best part of 40 years, and perhaps didn't have quite the negotiating muscle that the EU side had as a consequence. And at Best for Britain at the time, we were publishing reports looking at and written by Australian trade negotiators who had done an enormous number of them for Australia over the years, saying that what you would typically do would be to have industry on one end of the phone and your negotiating partner on the other, and they'd be saying, okay, 10%, and you'd be saying to your domestic people, can you live with 10%? No, but could you live with 8%? We can do 8%, and you'd land at 8.5%, and that the Johnson government wasn't doing that. Business did not feel sufficiently consulted at all. It was sort of done in such a rush and in spite of them rather than with them. So I think this government has done a better job at including input from important critical sectors, both in terms of the impact on their communities that they might have versus their necessarily economic value, but also those that are of very significant economic value to the UK. And I think that there does need to be...
Can I just chip in as well? I mean, if there was, like there is perhaps in some countries, where Parliament or the government or
Yes.
had a say, if it had to go through elected representatives signing something off, that's another negotiating tool, which is, well, we can't possibly agree to that because there's no way that our MPs will ever sign up to it.
Indeed.
We don't have that in the UK.
And one of our other...
Maybe you could say, as we're going through this, how best this committee, Parliament in general, can be scrutinising it as we're going through the process, because there is a real role for us that we haven't. Well, we're just starting to play, I suppose.
I mean,
No, I'll come back.
I mean, there are different layers, aren't there? I mean, I think if we're signing a trade deal, I mean, I was, to be honest, a little bit appalled by what happened to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in Parliament, where the whole thing's done in 24 hours. I mean, you'd struggle to read the TCA in 24 hours, let alone scrutinise it. So I think
we still bear the scars. Don't worry.
if you're signing major trade deals, there should be room for parliamentary scrutiny and parliamentary approval. I think it makes perfect sense to carry out negotiations in private. I think, the bigger question around there is one of comms, isn't it? Which is whether you want to bring people with you in what you're trying to achieve. And actually, there's been precious little in the way of pitch rolling, as far as I can see, around that. The biggest dilemma, I think, and I'm not sure I have an answer in terms of scrutiny and transparency, is what happens on a day-to-day level with the European Union. You've now got the Product Safety and Metrology Act, which allows a lot of alignment to be done by statutory instrument without scrutiny. You don't have the European Scrutiny Committee anymore. There is a bit of a hole in Parliament, I think, because, I mean, a lot of these decisions about where to align and where to diverge are just, by definition, massively political. They're about winners and losers. They're about, big issues of economic principle. And I do worry that it's there rather than in terms of the reset specifically, where I fear that we're not scrutinising things as well as we should.
Just on the scrutiny, I think my advice would be to focus relentlessly on the potential benefits of each of the measures in terms of how that is going to benefit either growth or politically, but also the costs, and in terms of the costs in three areas. One, any direct financial cost that the government might be incurring, and related to that debt when we think about the European Defence Fund loan scheme. Secondly is any cost in terms of risks to other strategic or trade relationships. And then the third one is political autonomy. So keeping, for example, defence sovereignty, to what extent has been a trade-off of autonomy over our own laws in terms of the things we talked about of the government implementing its own agenda. So they're the three costs I'd suggest the committee sort of focus on, comparing against any potential benefits.
Naomi Smith.
And to focus on cost or value, you need evidence. You need the data there. And so one of the other policy recommendations that the UK Trade and Business Commission published pre-election was the establishment of an independent Board of Trade modelled on the Swedish Board of Trade, which is often looked at as kind of like world leading, a bit like an OBR for trade, so on a statutory footing. It can publish independent impact assessment of changes to trade deals, new trade deals that may be about to be signed in terms of their impact on every region and nation of the UK, every sector within the economy, and so that then Parliament would at least have independent analysis of changes to trade deals that it could have
Why
before it makes a
why do
decision.
the Swedes have a board of trade if they're in the EU? Because the EU does their trade for them. I don't understand.
I mean, because they like to consult with business, they like to make sure that businesses have a say and a voice in everything that the Swedish government is doing that might affect them.
Okay.
Rather than, stuffing it full of your friends, which no comment, but previous governments may have done.
Thank you. And then moving on to security and defence policy, which I think is, we've been on a few visits to Ukraine and Brussels, and it's one area I think that politicians from every government we've spoken to have been very forward-leaning and asking us to do more. Ahead of the summit on the 19th of May, maybe Professor Menon, you can start off. And what do you think the UK should be prioritising in our security and defence cooperation?
I think the key thing is capabilities development, and that means access to some of the EU funds that have been created in the last few years to promote weapons development and collaboration between member states. I mean, there's been a problem with things like the European Defence Fund to date, which is they're defined in such a way as to exclude states that aren't in the single market. Yeah. Now, I don't think it makes any sense for us to be part of those conversations, given what's happening in European security. But as importantly, I don't think it makes any sense for the EU for us to be excluded. So I think that's the key thing. I mean, there are all sorts of other things around.
Do you think the cost of our involvement in that fund might be?
Well, I mean, we'd have to contribute to the fund, and obviously that's something that will need to be negotiated because there's always that conversation about how much you're putting in versus how much you're taking out. But if we're serious that over the medium term Europe has to be better equipped to take on a larger share of assuring its own security, I don't see how you do that without the UK and the EU working together and building the sort of capabilities of the future is part of that. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting stuff around the edges of that, which is whether the way we do procurement is in serious need of an overhaul. One of the lessons from Ukraine is agile technology that essentially Ukrainians are changing on their kitchen tables with screwdrivers, commercially available drones. So do you need these sort of massive, great defence corporations to dominate defence spending? But I mean, that's a debate for another day. But and then there's the sort of normal stuff around the UK-EU relationship, which is institutionalising cooperation. But actually, one of the things that the Ukraine crisis taught me, at least, is for that sort of stuff, we probably don't need much from the EU because we've cooperated very, very closely with them in a political sense, despite the absence of a formal arrangement. I think the key thing is around the sort of political economy stuff, the capabilities.
The defence industrial base. Yeah. Okay. And there's no scope for us to be involved in some sort of legal framework around European security, you think, at this point?
In what way?
Well, I mean, you're saying that everything that the EU does is quite legalistic. So is it worth looking through that particular lens when we're talking about security cooperation, or is that unhelpful, do you think?
I mean, it depends how far we're taking. I mean, a lot of this hinges on our assumptions about what Donald Trump's ultimate policy towards Europe is. I mean, a sort of benign view is we'll have to do a bit more, but things will remain pretty much as they are.
Yeah.
A more extreme view is the United States is no longer trustworthy. We have to look to alternatives for NATO. Now, it's the latter scenario that transpires, and there's a whole load of thinking that needs to be done about legal structures, because one of the problems, if you think about the conversations around coalitions of the willing in Ukraine at the moment, one of the problems is there simply isn't an institution that is capable of allowing Europeans, all the Europeans who are in the coalition of willing, so you sort of minus Slovakia and Hungary plus the UK, to work together independent of the United States, because that sort of institution simply doesn't exist.
I suppose there's the model of the Joint Expeditionary Force, isn't there, that has a different set of countries, but there might be something similar.
But it's not the political, it's not the planning process, it's not the sort of deployment plans and things. I mean, those of a certain vintage will remember the West European Union that was mothballed some years ago, but actually, ironically enough, that was created precisely in order to give Europeans that sort of framework, but it's no longer there.
Thank you.
Just on the European Defence Fund, so there's a couple of aspects to that. So there's this £150 billion loan fund, which is part of their funding. I think there's two ways the UK might be involved. One is if we were to draw on that fund for our defence spending, and then yes, there would be an understanding we would contribute to some way, and that would be an important question for the committee. What would that mean? How would the debt liabilities work? But the other aspect of it, even if we don't do that, is whether European countries using that money are able to spend some of that money on UK defence contractors, and that's what at the moment they've said that won't be possible unless there's some sort of agreement. I don't think it's specified what that agreement. We're going to get to that later on.
We're heading to a defence agreement with Europe. I don't think
there's no reason really for the EU not to allow their countries to access UK defence industry, because the UK defence industry is so advanced and so important, and the supply chains are so integrated. So I think that's something that's just worth the government and the committee sort of pushing on and exploring.
And there are really difficult decisions for governments here, because it'll require some governments to say, actually, we're going to stop making that. Because the problem with European defence, well, one of the many problems with European defence at the moment is fragmentation and duplication. Everyone's doing the same thing, and the stuff I make doesn't fit the stuff you make. And so actually, if it comes to actually fighting wars together,
I mean, this may be quite an advantageous process in order to get to a European fighting force that is more effective.
And that's why, in a way, Europe has ended up buying so much American kit, because at least if we all buy American kit, different countries can work it.
But there again, that hinges on your assumptions about the United States. It was very interesting 2 weeks ago to hear the Portuguese defence minister, who is a proven sort of Atlanticist, say we're going to have to reconsider our purchase of F-35s because they might stop us using the software.
Yes, exactly.
And so there are a lot of sort of assumptions you've got to think about future reliability.
Yes, absolutely. And the kind of increased use of black boxes, so that you buy American kit, but then you don't know what you're buying, and you can't control it yourself. No, I understand that. Thank you. Phil?
I'd like to ask a few questions about youth mobility, perhaps starting with Professor Menon. How important is youth mobility as part of the reset with the EU?
It's very important for some people on the EU side, which means it's very important. That is to say, I've never really understood why this was a sort of a necessary part of the thing, and the way in which some European states have said you either sign this or we don't negotiate further has struck me as slightly getting their priorities wrong. But it's important because for some on the European side it's seen almost as a proof of faith. Now, if you're serious about this, then give us this. Economically, I mean, it's interesting that a lot of high-skill sectors, a lot of services sectors, you talk to people in financial services in this country, are really keen on it because they see it as a way of getting access to talent. It's the sort of agreement, what I understand is being negotiated at the moment is very similar to the sort of agreement we have with a host of other countries. So in that sense, I don't think the economic impact will be huge. I think the political impact of us agreeing on the European side will be significant.
You mentioned about pitch rolling earlier in a slightly different context. So what do you make of the government seemingly softening of its position in public over the last few weeks on this issue?
Well, I don't know what the opposite of pitch rolling is, but it seems to me that that's what the government's been. I mean, I mean, this is one of the things I'd love to learn one day. I do not understand what the political utility of whenever you hear the word youth mobility saying the phrase freedom of movement. So just I think the way in which government ministers have responded to questions about this by saying we are not rejoining freedom of movement has created a link in my mind between youth mobility and freedom of movement, which is ridiculous because it clearly isn't freedom of movement.
Would you like to expand on that for the benefit of the committee?
Freedom of movement, I mean, the youth mobility scheme involves short-term stays with visas. So by definition, it is utterly different from freedom of movement. But the government have created that link by referencing it every time, which I thought was a strange political tactic because if I were the opposition, I would play back the government's own words if and when they sign up to a youth mobility scheme. So it seems to me that sort of language has made it harder to do what it looks like they intend to do.
And a question for Naomi Smith. What does the polling say on youth mobility?
In every single constituency, even in Clacton, it's popular. So 66% want a youth mobility scheme of 2 years, 50% 4 years. So you still have a majority of people in the UK supporting it for as long as 4 years, which I don't think is being discussed at the moment. I think it's looking like it might be 1 or 2 years, maybe with a 1 year extension at most. So it is extremely popular with all kinds of voters in every part of the country. And yes, Professor Menon is right. The EU will want this as part of a negotiation, and we've talked previously about our relative size to the US and the EU, and the fact of the matter is we don't have a huge amount to negotiate with, and a youth visa scheme is one of them. It is one of the things alongside everything that we can offer on defence and security that they are bringing as their asks of the reset. So it is very, very important, and it's incredibly important for young British people as well.
Has your organisation done any analysis on sort of cost benefit of
so
what
when we
might
did
mean to the UK?
When I mentioned the growth figures that we published from Frontier, and I mentioned that they were a floor, not a ceiling. That's partly because we didn't model, because it would have been a completely different kind of econometric analysis, the growth from a youth mobility scheme. So that one could only expect those 1.5 and 2.2 figures to go north if there was also such a scheme in place, because of all of the economic benefits that we know it can bring, plugging gaps in sectors like hospitality, social care, etc., but also because of the intangible benefit of it. You know, young people that come here today or go to the EU today are going to be the future, entrepreneurs of tomorrow and job creators. So in terms of cost-benefit analysis, what we have done is analysed the impact of the other 13 youth mobility schemes we have in place at the moment with Uruguay, San Marino, Iceland, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and we've looked at the numbers, and in 2023, I believe it was, more young UK people left to take up those schemes than young people came to the UK from those countries. So it is definitely something that young British people would like the opportunity to do more. And obviously, cultural exchange, learning languages, bringing all of those new ideas and skills back to the UK can only be of benefit to us here.
I think one of the things that is really important, really important in its own right, and I think really important politically as well, is to think about who gets to benefit from a youth mobility scheme, because rightly or wrongly there was a perception under freedom of movement that it was something that was done for the middle class to the working class. Mm-hmm. That is to say, if you were middle class, you got to go and do your lecture abroad very easily, or have your sort of Polish builder or whatever. But if you worked in a trade, all it gave you was competition. And so I think if and when they put into place a youth mobility scheme, trying to do it in a way that was as inclusive as possible. So it's not just about, Penelope going to Provence for a gap year, mm-hmm. but was far more broad in social terms. I think that's really, really important, just in its own terms, but also I think in terms of how this looks politically.
Mm-hmm. And Phil, can I go to Uma next, and then I'll come back to you if I need to. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been really fascinating listening to your evidence. I was in Brussels for the UK EU Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, and we really heard firsthand how important this youth mobility, or whatever the label is that different people are calling it, means to various EU member states, because it's not just having something written down, but it's a statement of intent, of mutual respect, of us really resetting the relationship. So I understand, Professor Menon, when you were saying, don't know why we're linking it, or the government is linking it to freedom of movement, but I think it's really important to make the differentiation, because there are people out there who are trying to mix the two things together, and this is about opportunities for the future, for business, for trade, for collaboration, for all the things you've all set out. Do you think improvements in the trade relationship are even possible if the United Kingdom says no to both the Erasmus or the youth mobility, or even one or the other, given the strength of feeling in EU member states? Do you think?
I think at this point it would be utterly bonkers if a security deal was stymied by a failure. I mean, in the current geopolitical context. So I think the security stuff will probably carry on. Mm-hmm. And that has economic implications, obviously, because of the procurement things we were talking about. The broader economic relationship, I think, will be very difficult to shift that. I mean, as it is, we've talked about the government's asks. The government's asks are a bit odd and slightly trivial in economic terms. I think I've lost count of the number of times the European Union has told us we can do nothing about touring artists because it's tied up with customs. They told the last government that 3 or 4 times. It's a curious choice of asks. But I think if we say no to youth mobility, then any prospect of SPS or anything in the trade sphere will become a lot more difficult at a minimum.
And what do you think this means for the wider context of the reset? The government have really gone heavy on the reset with the EU, given the state of play with US relations and the tariffs and things. What do you think, if this doesn't go through, what do you think that means for the future of the reset?
I'm not particularly optimistic about the future of the reset in economic terms anyway, because I think there's a real limit to what we can achieve and what the EU is going to be willing to give us. But it would certainly be it would look like a terrible diplomatic failure if you came out of the summit without anything agreed. I think the government also have stopped calling it a reset. They've started calling it strengthening the strategic alliance with Europe now, as far as I can see from...
I would just add that I think it would be very damaging for the government. We know that 43% to 14, so 3 times the number, expect the government to be pursuing a deeper relationship with Europe rather than with the US, and that's from our YouGov March poll of 2,000 people. And our YouGov poll in April of 5,000 people showed that the majority of people think the government is not going far enough. Only 15% think that the government is going too far in the reset, and about 15% about right. So I think if they come away more or less empty-handed, bar for the Security and Defence Pact, that would be perceived poorly by voters of government.
Just on the youth mobility, I wouldn't overstate the importance of tying that into other aspects of the reset. As I've said before, there are areas of mutual benefit, and in terms of security, in terms of trade agreements, we're a really important market for the EU from an economic point of view. So we shouldn't overstate the importance of tying up. It's clearly more important to the EU than to the UK, the youth mobility.
Wouldn't you say for the next generation, for younger constituents of ours, that actually is really important?
So it's more important for the EU in terms of the demand. So like at university, for example, we always found it really difficult to persuade our UK students to go to Europe on exchange, much harder than perhaps it's a language issue than the US or Australia and so on, whereas the other way around it was much easier. And just to throw in an issue for the committee might be worth thinking about, because there's been talk about university fees and bringing that down for EU fees to UK level. Perhaps just a question of how that would play in terms of subsidising EU fees, which the university sector suggests the base level UK fees are subsidising students at the expense of students from Nigeria or India or other parts of the world who might be on the full level. So I think that's an aspect of the relationship. So yes, of course, I love our students going back and forth, and that can be very, very beneficial. But it's more important from a point of view of demand for the EU than for the UK.
I would say, though, that the EU is pretty happy with the TCA status quo in terms of economics. That is, there's obviously gains that they can have from changing that, but actually, one of the frustrating things about talking about the reset in European countries is we've fallen off their list of priorities. That actually talking to us, negotiating with us is just not up there. So I think we forget sometimes that one of the things we have to do is entice them to negotiate. And actually, one of the really curious things is that's even true in security. We're used to assuming here that we're doing them a favour by saying that we're going to work. That's not how it's seen on the other side at all. They are giving us access to their collaborative schemes is how they see it. So sometimes strikes me there's a slight misalignment of perspective when it comes to that.
One final thing to add on that, the frontier economics work we did modelled the impact of tariffs on the EU and the UK, and in the situation where the EU is aligned deeply on services with the UK, they are shielded from the negative impacts of US tariffs by around a third. So there is also potentially that sweetener on top of youth mobility and defence and security for the EU when we do the negotiation.
Thank you. And Chair, sorry, I should have declared my membership of the UK Trade and Business Commission at the start of my question. So.
Oh, good. And also, just whilst we're pausing for a moment, just so that everybody knows, there's an urgent question on Kashmir at 12:30, and then a Home Office question at 1:15, and then an FCDO statement on the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister's visit, just so you'll know. Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Menon, can I remain on the theme of people and ask, what do you think the UK government will be seeking through this reset on law enforcement and tackling illegal migration through Europe into the UK?
On law enforcement and tackling crime more broadly, there's a two-pronged approach. You saw in the Memorandum of Understanding we signed with the Germans that we're planning to do stuff with individual member states. For me, on the reset, the important thing is to try to get quicker access to EU information that we lost access to after Brexit. I should add in parentheses that sort of access is tied very intimately to membership of the ECHR as far as the EU is concerned. So we lost access to things like the Schengen Information System too, and there are technical ways using Interpol by which we can perhaps prevail upon the EU to share more information more quickly via Interpol that we can get our hands on. There might be better ways of working together with Eurojust than we have at the moment. So there are technical fixes that we can use to improve information sharing. On the broader question of irregular migration, I'm not convinced everyone is struggling with the same problem and no one has a solution. So I'm not convinced that talking to the European Union is going to solve this problem. I've always been rather sceptical about a returns agreement because irregular migration is massively politically salient in the member states as well. So it'd be a brave EU government that says, we'll take people from you without sending people the other way. So I think that's going to be really difficult to agree anything on, to be honest.
And are those conversations that are happening between the UK and individual countries, or is this all at a EU level?
As far as I know, I am not privy to what the UK government is negotiating with individual member states. So the model of the German deal suggests to me that it is something they are going to talk about bilaterally, at least with some of them.
I wanted to ask you about how important a labour market strategy is in terms of migration, immigration to the UK and any future deals.
Well, clearly it's very important in terms of the labour market, in terms of short-term shortages, but also long-term productivity. And we've had this ongoing debate about the impact of large-scale migration at lower wage end of the scale, and how that may depress productivity and provide excessive competition for UK labour markets. I think we're now in a position where we can take this from a global point of view, and we have been since Brexit, and it's obviously not gone away as an issue. But I think that's probably important for us to bear in mind, that it's not just our relationship with the EU in terms of free migration. It's looking across the board that we can have ideally a more rational economic look at the sort of migration we want to see, where the skills shortages are, whether that's via a point system or some other mechanism. So I think it's important not to take the EU reset in isolation for looking at that. And at the moment, I think the government has struggled just under the weight of numbers, and that's sort of driven the political narrative, and that's perhaps prevented a more focused analysis of the type of managed migration that we want to see. And it would be really nice to get to a position where we can do that and look at what's really going to benefit us long term in terms of capturing global talent, in terms of really driving productivity.
Naomi Smith, has there been any polling on the public view on migration in relation to the EU?
Not that I've done, but there is a lot of polling in terms of migration very regularly, and I think Ipsos have probably got the longest running tracker on sentiment to migration. We've done it on youth mobility and freedom of movement, and actually freedom of movement was surprisingly popular when we polled it most recently, and again I'll share that with the committee in writing after this session. On the issue of managing migration, and I think successive governments have failed to plan for migration and population change. And when we look at countries like Canada that have done it much more effectively, it's because they've taken a much laissez-faire approach to managing migration. There is a lot more that goes into helping people learn English and French. State-funded schemes and projects for that, better proactive approach in terms of home building and making sure that people don't feel as though they are being sort of squeezed out of their area because of migration. So I think there is an awful lot, very separately from the reset, that governments could do in terms of managing population change. When it comes to specific skills, as Professor Paton mentioned, in the short term, we do have shortage occupation lists, and they are growing, and they have grown since we left the EU, particularly when we're speaking to sectors like hospitality in particular, but health and social care, agriculture, they are suffering acute shortages, and the problem is that the people who don't have jobs are not in the areas where those jobs exist. So, there is a very holistic view needed around transport, around housing, around access to jobs that exist, if you're thinking about filling them with the domestic market as well. But, very much welcome a joined-up approach with Skills England on looking at all of this in the balance, and it's got to be a twin-track approach.
We've done some work on the polling, if you want.
Great.
There's several things. On the macro level, one of the interesting things is that the public's concern about immigration and opposition to immigration are both significantly lower than they were in 2016. One of the most interesting phenomena we've seen in this country is that the salience of immigration dropped precipitously after the referendum. And if you think back, it wasn't really talked about in 2017 or 2019 elections. It's gone up a bit since 2021 in terms of salience and in terms of concerns. If you dig into it and ask people, okay, you want immigration numbers to go down, which of these areas would you like to see immigration numbers go down in? The only one where there is a massive, overwhelming support for fewer people coming is bankers. In all other areas, there is basically a plurality, at least, of people who say, actually, we don't want numbers to go down in social care or healthcare or students or whatever it might be. So people, even those people who think it would be good if the numbers were lower, if you provide them with the sort of different categories, struggle to make that work in a practical sense.
But in a visit I seem to have made to a by-election seat, we did have people talking to us regularly, not about what profession people had, but the fact that there were young men who they didn't know who they were and they didn't know where they came from, but they were in the centre of town, hanging around.
One of the issues,
making people feel excluded from their centre. So they don't tend to think of it in terms of, we need people for this job. It's the social impact, I think, of particular situations that has quite a big impact on people.
And also, I think the debate about irregular and regular migration gets muddled up quite often, which doesn't help in having any clarity for either.
It clearly does, and I think the point about the change since the referendum is very important. So the notion that we, in principle, had took back control over deciding who was migrating into the country was a very important pressure valve release, I think, for public opinion. But of course, that does come into tension when it's irregular migration, that people still see that there isn't any control there. So I think that's where that sort of tension comes in terms of people's slight ambivalence to migrants.
Afra.
Thank you. So since 2020 and the UK leaving the EU, the UK's fishing opportunities have actually increased each year. The current agreement, though, on fisheries expires in June next year. And, of course, there's been a very public discussion, particularly from some member states, about linking a defence and security agreement to fishing rights. So I just wanted to ask the panel, first of all, how far apart actually are the UK and EU on fish? But how can industries that are vital for some parts of the UK, in this instance particularly for coastal communities, particularly for Scotland, but they might be perceived small in comparison to some other sectors, how can they not get lost in these negotiations?
I think the latest we've been hearing is that both sides have agreed more or less to stick with the status quo on the fishing quotas. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the latest that we've heard, and we'll hear more about that in the coming
The status quo is that month. Next year it's coming to an end.
So. I think they're pre-briefing.
What's being briefed at the moment is that there are moves towards a sort of maintaining the status quo on a multi-annual basis, so it'll go beyond next year. And bear in mind, this is deliberate, the trade-off. When they made the fishing quota deal run out next year, they made it coincide with the deal on energy cooperation. So right from the outset, there was a very clear desire to do linkage on the EU side.
And you're right, the economic value of the fishing industry is one thing, but the contribution to the communities where they are based is enormous. and the fishing industry has been appallingly let down, and the catastrophic decimation, frankly, of that industry is not to be undermined at all. And if there's one thing we've heard again and again and again as we've been taking evidence as best have written at the UK Trade and Business Commission from the fishing sector, it's that we could have all the access to all of the fishing waters in all the world. If we can't get the fish to market, if we don't remove the trade barrier to sell it, it's pointless. So again, they are very supportive of removing those trade barriers and getting the alignment to help them actually sell a Dalgety Bay prawn that needs to get onto a restaurant table in Paris by lunchtime, and if it gets held up at the border, forget it, you've lost the lot.
But it's true to say that the catch in the UK has increased very significantly since before Brexit, as you'd have expected with the quotas, and that fish has been sold. So I don't think these are barriers that we can't get over. There'll clearly be disappointment, I think, in the coastal communities if the balance isn't further extended after 2026 in the UK's favour. That was certainly the hope. But there's clearly more pressure from the EU because, economically, the fishing industry is more important in certain countries in the EU than it is to the UK. But I don't think we should underestimate the political importance in the UK because it may be small in numbers, but there is scope for quite a lot of growth there, and these communities are very significantly affected, and I think I'm sure it'll be on MPs' minds. So, it'd be perhaps something for you to explore. I think it'd be very disappointing if the fishing industry was used as a negotiating tool for other areas that may end up not being so strategically important for the UK. So certainly something for the committee to watch out for.
Are there any lessons that the UK can learn from the recent EU-Switzerland agreements?
We got the SPSS agreement with Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland's a very different case because it's landlocked, so it's surrounded by the EU, so pretty much all food imports will go via at least one EU country unless they're flown in. My understanding is that does involve some element of dynamic alignment, which I think would, it's not being described as a red line in the government, but I think it would be consistent with a red line on the single market, that it would be a very big step to move on agriculture in a way that we agreed to European Court oversight and to change our laws dynamically. That'd be a very big step change with all sorts of implications for our other relationships, but also for our political autonomy. So that doesn't mean that won't be proposed, of course. I mean, we don't know what the government are negotiating over, but I thought that'd be a very significant step. And, it's hard to see how Switzerland is the right model for us to be looking at.
I mean, what the Swiss deal shows us is that dynamic alignment is the price of access that the EU will demand, and I don't think there's any flexibility on their side at all about that. Again, it's partly just down to size. The EU is a big enough market to think it can say to its neighbours, if you want access, you align dynamically. I think it's also worth stating that if you want to go beyond individual sectors that the EU is happy to negotiate in, the Swiss accept freedom of movement and pay into the EU budget. So I think there are very strict limits to what we can do whilst keeping to the government's red lines. And the final point worth making is that any EU policymaker you talk to, if you mention Switzerland, will grimace and say we hate the Swiss deal. So they're not in favour of duplicating that in any way, shape or form.
Can I just raise one point on the market? So we export in the agri-foods, including beverages, about £13 billion to the EU. They export to us about £46 billion per year. We are a huge market and much more important to them than they are to us in terms of the level. So that needs to be borne in mind in our negotiations.
We've got one more section of questions, and I want to try and get through it in 10 minutes or so that we can have a chance to get to UQs, those that want to. But Uma.
Thank you. What would you all consider to be the minimum set of outcomes from the 19th of May summit that you would deem a successful reset? I know we've differed on the 10 reset, but what would you say is a success? If you could summarise in sort of maybe 3 bullets.
Well, you get a security deal that gives us access to EU procurement funds, first and foremost, that the relationship is institutionalised in the sense that there is provision made for frequent interaction, not just at the official but also at the political level between us and the European Union. It's mad that the Chinese get an annual summit with the EU at political level and we don't, and so that needs to be written in.
Okay. Yeah.
And finally, I think if you want to build a relationship, there needs to be practical milestones built into the summit communique that don't just set out vague ambitions but say, we're going to negotiate on SPS and we expect to be able to report back by this date, that date. There need to be very clear, verifiable milestones to try. I mean, if the government is serious about sort of renegotiating, it needs to be written into the communique. That's my 3.
I'll probably just go with 2. One, the Security and Defence Pact, or whatever it's going to be called, is clearly urgent and of most significant importance. And then whether it's called a political declaration, a strategic partnership, a framework for future negotiations, whatever political title it gets given, a timelined framework for negotiations on all of the things that we know will remove that friction at the trade border, like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, of conformity assessment, the issues around touring artists, and then also whether this youth visa scheme can and will happen, and what flavour it will take, how long, what age limits, and when it can come into force. I think if we get that from the overarching ambition for the TCA reset into 2026, that would be great.
I think success can be gauged as much by what is in the agreement as by what is not in there. So it would be lovely to see some progress in terms of mutual agreements on trade facilitations and so on, but it would also be good to see that, for example, we retain defence sovereignty, that we retain political autonomy in terms of our laws rather than European court oversight, and that also we retain flexibility to continue to develop our geopolitical but economic strategic partnerships with other parts of the world, and they're not compromised by things that are in the reset agreement.
Yeah, thank you for your short answers.
I think really as a wrap-up question, I think that what I'd like to just is take on what Uma says and perhaps take it a little further. I mean, it seems as though we're all agreed that it's not going to get fixed in the next month or so, and that this is going to need to be an ongoing negotiation. And it kind of links back to our original questions, which is, what's the government's overall strategy? What is it that needs to be achieved? What do we think the government should be going for? And I suppose it's, so therefore, let me ask it this way. By the end of this parliamentary term, where do we hope that we will have got to with our negotiations with the EU, and how would we measure success?
I mean, the first thing I would say is, in the broad sort of gamut of things that the government does, this is not the priority. I mean, the priority is clearly economic growth, and it's clear from the terms of the reset that isn't seen as central to the strategy of economic growth, because, as we've discussed before, the things we're talking about in the context of the reset are not really that important when it comes to the sort of aggregate size of the UK economy. So my sense of the government's strategy on the reset has always been they want better, closer, friendlier relations with the EU and its member states, whilst actually committing to changing remarkably little of the extant economic relationship. Security is a completely movable feast because of what's happened since the US inauguration. So that's a different kettle of fish. But on the economics, the ambitions have been very limited to date, partly bound by red lines, partly, I think, bound by a desire not to have public debates about... Public debates about the EU and the reset is not where the government wants political debate to be. So, judged by those metrics, it's quite a low bar, I think, that we'd set for them by the end of this parliamentary term, to be honest.
Okay.
Their ambition needs to be delivered, and that is the growth. I mean, that is their number one stated ambition, and by the end of the parliament, they need to have delivered that. And I can't see another policy proposal or infrastructure project on the table at the moment that delivers you 2% GDP growth over this period of time. But alignment, I think, beneficial alignment rather than dynamic on goods and services can deliver that. And this is a point I should have made previously, when we asked Frontier to break down the GDP growth figures by nation and region of the UK, there is a disproportionate benefit in growth for, you'll be very pleased to hear this, East Midlands, West Midlands, Yorkshire and Dover, and the North East. Because it is those regions that are the manufacturing heartbeat of the UK economy. And so I think for the government, as it heads towards the end of the Parliament and into an election period, having delivered on not just economic growth, but well-distributed growth around the country, where people are beginning to feel that impact, is without question the most important thing for them to be focusing on as they head into this reset or rapprochement or whatever we call it now.
Thank you.
So I would say the reset is not going to be the driver for growth, so that's not the strategic driver for the government, and it's hard to disagree with Professor Menon's assessment that if we end up with friendlier relations but not changing that much, that might risk other aspects that do affect growth, that will probably be not too bad an outcome.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all very much for your time. We do appreciate it, and I know that Naomi Smith's already committed to sending us some further information. And if there is anything else that you haven't shared with us today and would like to send in, please do so, and we can add it to the evidence that we're collecting. Thank you all very much indeed for your time. That's the end of the hearing today.